Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode number 7 of Coffee and Issues. I'm Carroll Bernard. I'm joined today by Michael Lejeune, managing partner over at RSM Federal. How you doing today, Michael?
I'm great, man. I'm ready to rock and roll.
All right. What are we talking about today?
So I think we're going to be talking about how to find opportunities, because I know a lot of people can't necessarily find enough of those. So I know it's kind of a roundabout way we're going to be talking about it. So
I made a LinkedIn post this morning. What I said is that I've heard this same thing a lot of times over the years. And the statement is I'm not finding many or any relevant opportunities to pursue. And so I wanted to talk about that today because there's the basic things that everybody needs to do. Like, for example, for federal, get registered at SAM and then look for opportunities on sam.gov. You can set up search agents. You can learn how to do that. We have some training to help out on that. Also, work with your local PTACs. If you're not already working with a PTAC, Procurement Technical Assistance Center, I highly recommend that you engage with your PTAC. They have a good prospecting tool that actually can not only help you find federal opportunities, but also state and local opportunities from across the country. So these are 3 must things that you should do. And most likely, most people are doing those things. But even with those 3 things being done, there's still a lot of people who are saying, I'm not really seeing a lot. And today, this is what I want to talk about, Michael, is I'm not seeing a lot. Do you get clients of yours that mention this as well?
Yeah, it's probably one of the number one issues that people give us. They're like, hey, I'm in the system, but I'm not really seeing a lot that's for my industry. Or, hey, there's a lot of opportunities in there that look like they might be good, but once I start sifting through them, I realize that, hey, this is not a good fit for me. And so I spend a lot of my time sifting through opportunities that really are things we can't bid. And so that's probably one of the top issues.
Yeah, and I think that the sad thing here is that more times than not, once people goes through these initial phases of registering in SAM and watching SAM and then getting on the bid matching or a third-party bid lead service, and they're just not really seeing a whole lot that's relevant for them to bid on, then they just say, well, I guess this is just not the market for me, and then they leave. But there's a lot that they're not seeing. And today I want to explain why that is. And then let's talk about how people can actually find more relevant opportunities to pursue. By the way, I don't want to only talk about federal, and federal is one aspect, but we talk about the government marketplace on this show. We're talking about, federal, state and local. That can include like your cities, your ports, school districts. Well, they call it the SLED marketplace, right? State, local, and education. And then there's the Fed marketplace. And there's so much that's kind of boosted about the federal marketplace being the world's largest buyer, something like $500 to $600 billion a year. And that is true, right? The federal market's the world's largest buyer. But if you were to actually aggregate all of this spend of all of the state and local agencies combined, which is essentially the same thing that you really need to do when you're talking about federal government, because it's not like you go to one source to just basically sell. Every agency is different. They're just like state and local, except they kind of more follow one set of regulations. But if you were to take all of those state and local and aggregate them into kind of like one market source, you're talking like about probably 3 times the spend of the federal government.
Yeah, it's huge.
With I think I saw something like 90,000 agencies out there. So when I'm talking about opportunities today, I don't all just want to talk about federal. I also want to talk about how can you really start to find state and local opportunities, because if you can find those, and if you can find your sales process and go after that, you could really have a lot of opportunity open up for you if you know how to approach it.
Yeah. And I think for the SLED market, if you will, I think a lot of times if you are what I would consider like a regional service provider, or whether it's service products, whatever, and you're focused in a region, then the SLED market is often going to be really appealing to you, because maybe the Fed market where they're spending the dollars is not in your region. So sometimes that's a really good differentiator. If you're limited geographically, you may want to focus more on that SLED market.
Yeah.
Most of my clients do focus on the federal, and I'll tell you why I focus on the federal. I got one main system I need to go in to search for opportunities, one main system to go in to look at the data and all that, and it happens to be the same one. Whereas in the SLED market, you may have multiple systems that you have to go in to track opportunities. Then you get into the education space, and some of those have their own websites for procurement and things like that. So there's just a lot more things you need to know. Then you dive into, say, a state like California or New York, but especially California, and the regulations are so different. So you really have to learn that stuff when you're dealing at a state and local level. There's just more things you need to learn. But if I'm only focused in California, or I'm only focused in Oregon or Idaho or whatever, then it allows me to focus on that state and really dig into just those opportunities. But I think it's a mistake for people to try to focus on all 50 states at once. You go into information overload right out of the gate. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always best to really kind of locally, because not only are you local, but you can go to maybe local procurement fairs, meet people face to face. If you can start there and you establish some business locally, then you can examine how that process worked for you.
Right.
Because ideally, here's what you want to do is you want to develop a proven and repeatable sales process that you can take either to the federal or to state and local agencies.
Right.
But part of that business development process is going to be doing some fact finding. We talked about the fact finding here, and where the federal government might look to one place to buy, some of those state and local agencies might look to other places to buy. And so this is what we'll talk a little bit about today. And yesterday we were just doing a podcast for construction firms, and we were kind of talking about the same issue, right? Where a lot of things, if you're just kind of looking at the basic systems, SAM and bid leads, you're not going to see a lot because there's a lot of different places where agencies can post. So what I would like to do right now is I'd like to give a little bit of a visual to the folks listening in today of what I call the acquisition pyramid. So if you could close your eyes and imagine a pyramid, a multi-layered pyramid. Now, this pyramid could be working both for federal, state, and local almost equally. It's just the way that they purchase and where they purchase might be a little bit different. So typically when a buyer has something that they're buying or contracting out for, the first place that they're going to go is to their own agency contracts. Now, agencies have multi-year contract vehicles. Yesterday, we were talking about construction IDIQ contracts that might come open for recompete once every 5 years. But also in state and local contracts, they also have their own IDIQ contracts. Sometimes they'll call it professional services agreements or something like that, where it's just things like once every 5 years, 3 years, whatever the periodicity is, they'll go out and they'll solicit and get maybe either one contractor in place for multiple number of years, or maybe they will put a multiple pool of contractors so that they can go to this contractor pool and continue to get competition. Now, when it comes to the federal government, those typically go out on SAM, but with state and local, those will typically come out wherever they are publicizing their own requirements. So if you're not looking at the right place at the right time and you happen to miss that one, and let's just say last week, I was not looking at state and local bid matching or bid leads or anything like that. So maybe I missed this thing that was right up my alley last week. Okay, now I'm going to sit here probably for 5 years until that thing comes back for recompete. So if I'm looking year after year and I'm not seeing anything, I'm like, well, shoot, I don't understand this agency and how they're doing things. I know that they probably buy this, but I don't know how the heck did they do that. It's probably because they have established contract for that and they have a contractor that's doing that. And sometimes when people call into the agencies even say, we already have a contractor doing that. When is the next competition coming out? I think is a good question to ask. So that's layer one. That kind of is like the top layer that they go to first. Do you have any comments on that layer, Michael? And then we'll talk them down.
If I back up just a little bit, I think one of the reasons that people don't know about these layers that we're going to go through and don't really follow through on them is really the heart of the mistake here. And that is, most people, when they get started, they do exactly what you said. They sign up in SAM and then they just start looking for opportunities. There isn't a strategy behind it. And because there isn't a strategy behind it, that leaves them not knowing to look at these opportunities or these layers that we're talking about in the pyramid here. So, for example, if I just started and I'm in construction, I may just look for the keyword construction, or I may look at a NAICS code and say, well, there's no opportunities. Well, when you get in this market, and I may sound like a broken record on this, but I say it all the time. Step one is let's find who buys what you sell. Okay, that's step one. Step two is let's find out how they buy what you sell. And that's this layer one that we're talking about is how are they buying what you sell? Are they buying it on the open market? Are they buying it through simplified acquisition? Are they buying it through a specific status? Like I had a client the other day that was SDVOSB, and he was like, oh, I was told that SDVOSB is the status I need for this agency. And we started looking at the numbers. And I'm like, actually, 90% of the status purchases they buy are WOSB. That's why you're not seeing anything in SDVOSB, because that's not how your client buys. They're buying through a different status, and they're using these contract vehicles. And so that's why you can't find anything and you don't know to go, hey, now that I know there's these 5 contract vehicles at the VA, I've either got to get on those or become a sub to somebody, or else I'm never going to get, or there's going to be a trickle. I don't want to say never. There's going to be a trickle of opportunities when there's really this fire hose of opportunities going on that I don't know where the fire hose is. So I think that's the challenge of even identifying this layer for most people is they haven't done the data research to say who buys what I sell, how do they buy it, and then let's dig in and see what's there. I think that's relevant regardless of whether you are in the Fed or the SLED market. You're just going to use 2 different sets of data tools in order to do that research.
Yes. And sometimes, we can see some of this stuff with quantitative analysis, historical spend data in the federal market, but the state and locals don't really have that. So you have to more rely on your qualitative side, which is the asking of good questions. So when you're talking to buyers and they're saying, hey, get registered and just watch. Okay, well, that's what the advice that people usually get registered as a vendor, and then just basically keep an eye out, right? Because that's really all that they can tell you. But if you dig in a little bit more, say, well, do you have a contract established for this already? When might that come up so I can make sure that I'm looking for that at the right time? One of the things that we talked about on your podcast yesterday when we were talking about construction firms in particular, and this relates to a lot of people as well, a lot of the reasons why you're not seeing things posted at SAM, if they're going directly to those contract holders, is that the way that this contract works for construction and other similar like multi-year contract vehicles is that basically the government says, hey, we're going to put this contract in place, get a contractor or multiple contractors on board, and over the 5 years, we're going to push most of the individual opportunities through them. So if that's one company or multiple, they're going to get a lot of the opportunity. And I think I shared yesterday that when I was a buyer at the VA and we had a IDIQ for construction called a MATOC, probably about 90% of our projects went through that. So if all you were doing was looking at SAM or even bid matching systems, you're not going to see like 90%. So that's why visibility at the top and figuring out a strategy to get there. And one of the things we talked about too, the irony in this is like, some of these contracts are valued like at $50 million to $100 million. That doesn't necessarily mean if you get the contract, you're going to get $100 million. That just gives you the opportunity to receive awards up to that ceiling. Then you'll be competing with other vendors inside of that small pool, but it puts you at a new layer of opportunity that will help you see a lot more there than you will see at the publicized acquisition level.
Right. And I think you bring up a really good point there. A lot of times people think that if I call the contracting officer, I call a small business office, I call one of these people, they're going to tell me what I have to do to win contracts. Well, their job is not necessarily to teach you how to be a government contractor at whatever level. And so a lot of times they're going to answer the questions you put in front of them. Hey, how do you buy this? Well, we usually do that through an RFP or this or that. And then they shut up. And so if you don't ask another question or a good question, you're not going to get good answers. And so you have to get better at some of these questions like, hey, what are the top 5 contract vehicles you use to procure this type of service? You've got to specifically ask that, or they may never say, oh, well, we use these 3 contract vehicles. Oh, hey, we tend to do it this way. Hey, out of the statuses, which one are you, just hitting the mark on every single year? Is there one you're not? And why is that? Maybe I could assist that because I have a status that you don't necessarily have, a lot of access to. And so it's just asking them a lot of questions because, again, I found a lot of times we get a lot of yes or no answers out of contracting officers until you ask them open-ended questions. And I guess the best way to put it is just better questions.
You got to drill down because even when I was a contracting officer, and I used to like to talk to people. In fact, I got reprimanded one time from giving contractors too much information. So my job here is perfect now, but I could give everybody enough information. But people would call me and I pretty much would give them the same answer if they were not already positioned inside of the MATOC. Just watch FBO because that's really the only thing you can do right now is watch until we get maybe a new contract coming up or go subcontract with one of the incumbents that already has the contract, which is another option for those who are listening to this. If you can identify who's got that top level contract and maybe going after $100 million contract is not something that you're going to do. If you could know who those people are inside of those contracts, then you potentially get positioned to do business with them under a subcontractor agreement. So
yeah. And, this is really based on what you sell, and it requires just a little bit of research sometimes because we've had clients come to us and say, hey, I know the government's buying $6 billion a year, whatever it is, right, in this service, but I can't figure out how. And you start to do a little research, and this was a trucking company that came to us a few months ago. And I said, well, the reason that you're not seeing opportunities for this specific type of shipping is because there's this massive like $5.6 billion contract and you've got to go register on the Prime's website. There's a Prime contractor who's managing that for the whole government. And if you go register in their website and then upload your data in here, you're going to start getting emails daily on all the opportunities, but they're not showing up in SAM. And you just didn't know that. So like sometimes it's as simple as finding something like that and boom, you really just hit the mother load of now there's all these opportunities flowing to you because now you're looking in the right direction. The way I look at it is there's very few things that the government doesn't buy. And there's very few things that the government, I would say, has kind of locked you out of. Very few things, but 90+% of the time, it's just a matter of finding, well, where is it? Where is, and then, boom, okay, it's over there versus over. And I've been looking over here all day long. We had a client that came to us a while back and said, hey, I heard Department of Transportation buys what we sell. They buy it by the tens of millions or billions. And I did some research and I said, well, you're right. They do buy what you sell, but they've only bought $200,000 worth of it over the last 25 years. It's actually this department. So they've been looking in the wrong department for 3 years. So,
and one thing more I'd like to say before we kind of move down to the next level is that if your strategy, this applies both to prime contracting as well as like subcontracting. Anytime there's subjectivity in who the buyer can bring on. Could be a buyer at the prime contractor looking for subcontractors, could be the government itself, but build relationships. Don't just go and sign up at, even if there's a prime, they say, hey, yes, go through our vendor portal, get signed up, and then something might break loose for you. Take some time to go and develop some relationships with the people inside of that, the right people. So, because a lot of times you're having the conversations, you're going to basically be able to maybe access and open up more opportunities than just maybe being on a list of 100 vendors. That's like, okay, who do we go to now? You know, we have 100 minority businesses here. We have an MBE goal under this contract. Who do we go to? Typically, they will go to the people that they know, like, and trust, which is one of the things we talked about previously.
Yeah. And think about that for a minute there. People assume that everything going on in the government is fully automated. Like, hey, there's these contract vehicles. It kicks off a new task order that comes out and it's going to all these contractors. And they think that it is this very sophisticated system that's kicking out all this work and you just have to scoop it up. When in reality, there are individuals that are putting those things out there and putting them in front of eyeballs. Those same individuals also know a lot of the stuff that's not coming out yet, what's coming down the road. They know all the little nuances that are not in the solicitation. And so if you do build a relationship with them, they may be in the background thinking about, man, we've got this problem. We'd sure like to solve it, but I don't know a single contractor that can do it. Let me just put that on the back burner and let me handle this one. And all of a sudden, now they know you and they can make connections within the contract vehicle for you. They can say, hey, now we've got a contractor that can solve this problem. Let's push this out. There's so many things that can happen from the relationships with a conversation where you can't have a conversation with a database.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really good piece of advice you gave about building the relationships, not just trusting the data to flow to you through an email in their vendor portal. There's more to this than just sitting back and wishing and hoping. So
absolutely, man. And if you happen to get wind of a big opportunity, sometimes there's a lot of chatter that'll start happening about opportunities before they're even publicized. And so if you're like a subcontractor and you see that there's this big thing coming down, you start to know who the players are that are probably going to win. Watch the opportunity. Once they win, reach out to your contacts and be like, hey, I'd love to bid on this particular scope of work if you guys are going to be subcontracting that out. And that's where a lot of opportunities can kind of start to materialize for people. Whereas just sitting back, it's not a really great plan, right?
Well, and my last point on that is if the first time you heard about it was in an email or when they published that RFP, RFQ, whatever, the odds are you're so far behind the curve, you're going to have trouble putting together the RFP. You're going to have trouble pulling together a team if you need a team. And the odds are you're not going to win. That's just the facts. So being able to talk to these people, hear about this stuff. I've got a client that's been preparing an RFP for 6 months. The RFP hasn't come out yet, but they knew about it. They've been watching it. They've been talking to the contracting officer. The contracting officer even went as far as they put out a source of sought. And so 6 months, they've had their RFP ready. They've had their teams in place. They're ready to hit go as soon as that thing drops. And they've built really good relationships with the customer in the last 6 months. And so they're really positioned well to win it. And it hasn't even come out yet. So think about that. There's a lot of people that are making those moves in the background. And if you aren't one of them, the RFP comes out, you throw together an RFP response, you throw it out there, and then you're like, oh, we didn't win. Why didn't we win? You weren't prepared.
One last point on this at the highest level before we move on is if you know that these contracts are recurrent in nature, meaning that every 5 years they'll get recompete. When you're having the conversations in with the contracting folks, the procurement people, ask them if they can share a copy of the previous solicitation with you. Usually they have readily access to this previous solicitation, and you don't even have to do like a Freedom of Information Act request, or with a lot of public agencies, they'll call it a public records request. But a lot of this data is very accessible. Yeah, some agencies these days, like the city of Seattle, if you know where to go on their website, not only can you get like the solicitation, but you can get a copy of the contract right now. You can see what it was awarded for, what the scope is. So what can you do with that information? You can start to study that acquisition, and you can see if this were out on the street, because a lot of times the last time they put it out is going to look very similar maybe the next time. Not always, but most of the time. So you can start to say, if this were on the street today, what's our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Who do we need to
Would we be
partner
competitive?
with? Right. Look at the pricing. You could get so much intel just by that, just digging. So that's all I think I'm going to say about the top level of the pyramid right now. I think we talked about that one a lot.
Yeah. And maybe that's the whole podcast today. You know, it's hard to say. Well, I would say one more point about what you just said. I do get this as a question all the time. People will say, hey, I found this contract awarded, but I cannot find the original RFP. And a lot of times it's because the numbers are different. So like they'll have an RFP number and then an actual award number, and they don't match. And that's why you can't find it. And that's why it's usually very helpful to ask a contracting officer, hey, what was the original RFP for this? Because I can't find it because the numbers don't match. So,
yep, that's a good point too. So let's like close our eyes again and go down to the next layer of the acquisition pyramid. So we only covered the first layer. So as the contracting or officers or the buyers or the procurement people, purchasing agents, whatever they called in the role that they play. So they look to the top, If they don't have any contractors positioned there, then they go down to the next layer, which I call special programs. Now, in the federal government, those special programs are pretty specific. You've got about really two that are looked to a lot, Unicor and Ability One. Unicor, formerly known as Federal Prison Industries, they actually produce a lot of things that the government procures. Ability One, they do a lot of employment of people with disabilities. And they actually, if you look at a lot of General Services Administration contracts, even though there's GSA schedules, which we'll talk about that in the next layer, but even in GSA, sometimes, like for example, janitorial services, they will go to these Ability One contractors before they go down to the next level. Maybe other agencies don't use that, and maybe definitely your state and local agency might have a different process altogether for where they buy janitorial services, for example. So could be positioned at the top, it could be positioned in a special program, or it could be positioned at the next layer down that we'll talk about next. But just like the federal government has special programs, the state and local agencies might also have some special programs on how they buy stuff. So again, understanding where the government basically goes to shop and understanding how you can position yourself within that. I know if you go to Unicor and Ability One websites, you can see they actually have opportunities for contractors to integrate and do some things together. So that's another area to look at. Any thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, no, I think as you start to learn your agencies and learn how they buy what you sell, you'll find that some contracting officers will stick to layer one, and that's as far as they're going to go. And some will go through the layers of that pyramid all the way to the end. They will exhaust everything possible before they go on the open market. It just depends on the contracting officer, and that is different from agency to agency. It's different from office to office. You may have two people sitting next to each other, and one sticks in the top layer that goes to the open market. And maybe they have a bunch of contacts because they've been in the business for 20 years and they never have to make it out of that first layer, where the next person may say, I'm just going open market. It really does depend on that contracting officer, the relationships they have, and kind of the thought process that's put behind the acquisition, the size of the acquisition. Obviously, if you have things that are much smaller, there's probably not going to be near as much strategy put into those as things that are larger dollar amounts where, hey, this is a little bit more complicated, so we're going to award this in batches, or however we're going to do it of IDIQs. They just, again, the complexity grows with the size.
Right.
And then it also grows with, hey, what are contract vehicles that are out there? Another challenge that I see some of these layers, not just the specific to this one, is that contract vehicle, what I consider moving and spitting out opportunities. When Jedi came out, everybody thought, okay, are they going to start pumping out opportunities? Nope. We're going to spend 5 years on this, and then we'll
have to wait for Return of the Jedi.
Yeah. I think I put that out in the note. I was like, is this too soon? I don't think we're going to see a Return of the Jedi. But, you see that with some contract vehicles where contracting officers are getting ready. Okay, this thing gets awarded. And then it goes in this protest cycle. And they're like, we've got to change our strategy and go back to the drawing board. And so this is a pretty good level here where, hey, this is stuff that's well established. It's spitting out opportunities as expected is how I would say it.
Yeah.
And so if a contracting officer gets to this level, it's something that's very reliable for them.
Yeah.
So,
and just, you mentioned protests. Protest is one of the reasons why contractors like to go up and pull from the higher layers, because they're less subject to protest at those higher layers. We could get into a whole webinar on that. In fact, we have some on Gavology, but in the open market, the acquisitions are a lot more subject to protests, and that is a big pain in the butt because like everything stops until this thing gets resolved. And so that's another reason why buyers like to buy that. But they're also a lot of times directed by law. So if you look at the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 8 kind of sets forth a specific hierarchy. And it's kind of, if you look at that, it'll, in a way, mirror my acquisition pyramid. My acquisition pyramid is a little bit just a graphical representation to try to help wrap your brain around it. But let's go into the next level. So they went to the top, they went to special programs, maybe they don't have any contractors or special vendors there that basically are going to give them what they need. The next layer down, I like to call it cooperative purchasing. Now, this is where you start to get into GSA schedules. So there's the GSA federal supply schedules. There's the VA manages all medical equipment on their federal supply schedules, which is also kind of part of federal supply, right? So GSA manages everything else pretty much except for medical. VA manages medical on their FSS. That's cooperative purchasing. Sometimes they'll call it government-wide acquisitions contracts, especially once it's related to IT. But GSA is not the only place where they do IT. You know, there's NASA SOUP, cooperative purchasing vehicle. If you're looking at selling to a state or local agency, they have both cooperative purchasing, like big organizations like US Communities. It's kind of like almost like GSA schedules for state and local. But then you also have more localized cooperative purchasing agreements, like sometimes they call it piggyback contracts. How that works is, for example, when I worked at the city of Vancouver, Washington, we piggybacked off of some of the contracts that were set up by the county instead of doing our own. So if you're trying to sell to a city and they're saying like, we don't buy that directly, that might be because they're buying it, piggybacking off of another county contract. So you really need to understand the cooperative purchasing. You know, and this is what I use it as an analogy a lot. Bob Cones and Barriers, you know, so there's a local vendor here, Bob's Cones and Barriers. And how does Bob sell his cones and barriers to government agencies? Because a lot of times we haven't even touched on acquisition thresholds yet, and why a lot of things don't get publicized just by sheer threshold limits, right? We're going to talk about that before we're off today. But it could be that Bob's Cones can be a purchase card transaction. You never see those. And there's no even competition requirement for those. If Bob makes a connection, now that's not even a cooperative purchasing. But like if they say, hey, you know, we buy these things all the time. So Bob, you need to go and put your cones in US Communities. And not only will you be selling to us, but also many other agencies across the United States that buys cones and barriers. What are your thoughts, Michael, on that layer of acquisition?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating one. I mean, I go back to my time in the Army, and I knew our purchase card had about $3,500 limit every month. And
yeah, now that's 10,000.
Yeah, I mean, but back then it was 3,500. And I knew if we needed something, we were going to the field, we were going to NTC or something like that. My boss was at Office Depot, or I mean, that was before, you know, they're doing a lot of shipping online. He's like, hey, let's go to Office Depot. Hey, let's go to Walmart. Let's go wherever, and just, okay, throw it all in a cart and swipe it.
Yep.
That's just how it was. And it didn't matter if there was a contract vehicle. And I think the one thing we haven't really talked about in relation to a lot of this is speed. And so sometimes speed is a massive factor in choosing a contract vehicle or an approach. And in this particular case, with a purchase card, hey, we need this today.
Right.
And I don't have time to go through any other whatever process with paperwork. I'm just going to go swipe my card and buy this. And occasionally we'd hear back, hey, you really shouldn't buy this way. We have a contract for that. And my boss would be like, I don't care. Yeah. So, and his card refreshed the next month and he's back to spending, right?
Yeah.
And so when speed is a factor, sometimes they will choose a route like that because, hey, I need this today. I need it tomorrow. I don't want to go through the paperwork. This is going to be approved and I can just do this. And that's why I would choose one contract vehicle over another, is maybe it's a speed factor. And I know I can get it like that. So.
Or convenience, right?
Yes, it's convenient.
Like if I need a camera for our public affairs officer today, and if I'm located in Portland, Oregon, actually, I did a purchase on that. And I was, for a while, when I worked at the SBA, I was the office P card holder. So if the public affairs guy needed a camera, let's run down the street and get a camera, put it on a credit card. Call it a day. It's under the micro purchase threshold. It's quick and it's convenient.
Yeah. Or imagine that person's traveling and somehow the airlines broke a lens or they dropped the lens.
Right.
And, hey, I've got to have this because we're, you know, doing a photo shoot at the White House later. And there's no exception to this. So speed and convenience are often a big factor in choosing how they do it. And again, there's less red tape in some of that stuff. People overlook the credit card. The largest credit card transaction I had was actually on 9/11 from the FBI. They spent $200,000 on their Amex.
Yeah.
And, you know, boom, they needed it and they just did it. And
Urgency of need.
so,
And that's a whole good other topic, the whole urgency of need, because a lot of people know that what the standard acquisition thresholds are for micro purchase, but what they sometimes don't see is that based upon sometimes urgency of need and in an emergency or special environments like COVID, you see that those thresholds increase. So Mike, the next place down, we've talked about the agency specifics. We talked about the special programs. We talked about cooperative purchasing, and now you get down to the open market layer where it's like, if I looked in all of these channels and I don't see what I need to get, now I can go to the open market. When a new vendor is registered at SAM and watching SAM opportunities, those are open market opportunities. Those are like the last place that the buyer is going to typically look. So if they can buy up at the higher levels, they're not going to post it to SAM. But also, SAM doesn't even include every open market opportunity. SAM only includes open market opportunities that are expected to exceed $25,000, right? So if you have a product or a service that's maybe $5,000 on your average sale, or $10,000 or $15,000, those are likely never going to hit SAM. So now you got to figure out what I call a threshold strategy. Okay. And that's understanding where they buy at the specific dollar level. So there's a selling strategy for micro purchases. There's a selling strategy for things that might be between the micro purchase threshold and the publicizing threshold. And that's another way. And so that's where it's just like, I hope today that everybody maybe starts to get a bigger picture of where they can find more relevant opportunities to bid. And I want to read up a list of locations that I have put down for this today that an agency can buy. Most of these are federal, and I'm sure that I didn't capture them all. So let's talk about it. Like SAM, okay, you can watch SAM. We talked about agency IDIQ. We talked about GSA federal supply schedules. We talked about NASA SOUP. We didn't talk about Unison Marketplace, formerly fedbid.com, reverse vendor auction platform. We didn't talk about fedconnect.net. We didn't talk too much. We talked a little bit about GSA already, and GSA Advantage, it's like the Amazon online for the government. They can buy direct from the vendor, either through one of those lower micro purchases or a sole source contract or an 8A sole source contract under special authority. They can buy through the dynamic small business search. So that's the SBA profile. When small business get registered at SAM, they show up in this exclusive list, dsbs.sba.gov. If a contracting officer doesn't need to publicize it, but it's maybe $15,000, typically they'll go out and get 3 quotes from vendors that are located there. You got prime contractors that they buy through. You've got the cooperative purchasing, you got Ability One, Unicore, OTAs, pitch days, micro purchases. We talked about that. US communities and piggybacks. I'm sure I left some out, Michael, but that's a lot of different variant places.
Yeah, I think you hit a lot of them. And I think to sort of sum up the whole conversation a little bit, I want to put it in perspective this way. Everybody that's listening today is a buyer. You buy stuff. You buy stuff for your family. You buy stuff for your business. And every buyer has their preferences of the way they buy stuff. So there's some people like your wife, for example, who loves Amazon. And that is the preferred method. So if I looked at your credit card purchases, probably 85, 90% are going to be for like products like that you would get on Amazon or from Amazon, but only maybe 5 or 10% will be from a Walmart or an Overstock or another vendor. The same thing when it comes to like our grocery shopping. Most people have a grocery store. They like to go to their grocery store and pick out their whatever. And that's just the way most families are. But like you're grocery shopping, you're like, hey, man, I can't find this one fruit. So I'm going to make an exception after I've done all my bulk purchasing of groceries, and I'm going to go to this store to grab this 1 or 2 things. It's the same thing with contracting officers.
Right.
A lot of times agencies and contracting officers have their preferences. Hey, I like to buy using this contract vehicle. I like to buy using these 2 contract vehicles. And then when I can't get that, then the scraps or the smaller pieces fall down to the bottom into the open market. And that's how they work. So that's why it's so important to get to know these people. So who buys what you sell and then how they buy what you sell. And figure out what are their preferences at this agency with this particular person at the agency. And once you do that, then light bulbs will go off for you all day long. You'll be like, oh, this is why I was having a challenge. And then you get into the micro purchase stuff and realize, oh, it's not being reported because it doesn't have to. Oh, there's all these things at the micro purchase level that they could be doing if they knew about me and knew about the solutions that I have that are at this micro purchase level. And so then it opens up a whole new floodgate as well. And so I just think it's really important to understand that. And that is really why you're not necessarily finding the opportunities. In addition to NAICS codes, PSC codes, keywords you may not be using, because we get really laser focused on just a few types of things, but it's really about the buyer's preferences. Right. And even when you get into that, maybe this contracting officer likes to call it IT, where this guy calls it information technology. And that differencing keyword will show up in how it's put into the solicitation description, as well as, hey, I'm old school and I've been doing this for 20 years and I use this NAICS code. Well, guess what, Bob? That's not the right NAICS code anymore. You should be using this one, but Bob's still using the wrong NAICS code. But you got to get to know Bob to figure that out. And so there's just a whole lot of little things like that.
Absolutely, man. Two things like I'd like to kind of just piggyback on a couple of points that you said. You mentioned Amazon. We talked about quick and convenient. Some people with certain products may consider getting on Amazon and getting their products there. What a lot of people don't know right now is that the government actually has some big contracts with Amazon. And one of the things that Amazon has also been doing is that they've been categorizing small businesses. So if you are like a minority-owned business, you've got your certification, or a veteran-owned business, you can actually send that certification when you get your products on Amazon. They actually literally like look at your certificate and like, if you're legit, they're best, okay, we'll put them into this category. So they're building now ways buyers can go in, and if they're trying to do business with small business and get some of their going under that spend that they do at Amazon, they can go and look specifically for that kind of business. This is relatively new, but I think that in the future, as buyers start to know about, I don't even think a lot of buyers really even know about this, that this exists, but I really believe that, like, because of the quickness and convenience of Amazon, a lot of micro purchases are already going there now. So maybe your strategy, it's like, okay, you get your products on GSA Advantage, but maybe, hey, people are buying from Amazon because they can get it here much quicker, maybe even than purchasing through the GSA. Yeah. So
a really good point.
So that's just one thing. The last thing I want to make mention of that we really didn't touch on is that creating your own opportunities. So sometimes the buyers are not looking for it, but you know that they need it, right? So reaching into the agencies, and as you ask these right questions, you might have something that you want to offer, and you don't always have to wait for a solicitation to hit the street or for them to reach out to you. Look at your house. If you're looking at your house, like we just bought a new house and we had like all these people coming out, like ADT coming out, right? Like, I don't want ADT, but you know what? I might want that termite guy that I didn't know, but termites are prevalent in Florida, and like, let's get that service. And they come to me with the offer. So I don't go out soliciting. That's another thing that you can think of. Just don't sit back, wait for a solicitation, especially if you know that the government's not going to probably put out exactly what you buy in the exact way that you sell it, right? Reach out to them. As you ask the questions, they might already be doing something similar. Maybe you have a better value proposition, and through conversation, you create an opportunity and they invite you to say, yeah, give me a pricing on that, right? I think we covered just about all of it, man.
Yeah, we hit a lot of stuff today. And the one thing I'll say about Amazon is absolutely making some moves in the government market. We've seen that. Keep your eye on that. I would not doubt if 10 years from now, I don't know if it would replace GSA in any way, but I wouldn't doubt there's a monster AWS division that is really focused on providing products, possibly services through different contract vehicles. And we may see a next generation contract come through there. We may see people selling more products through there, right? Because they have the infrastructure on the back end to make sure those things are getting shipped and on time and all that kind of stuff. And so
it's amazing.
So it's gonna be interesting to watch what happens in government over the next 10 years with Amazon, Walmart, and some of the other services that are out there.
You take a look at what happened with reverse auctions. GSA used to run reverse auctions. Then private industry started doing it, and they're just like, well, let them do it. They're doing pretty good at that.
Yeah. I mean, occasionally the government does say, hey, we don't do this very well. They're doing a good job at it. Let them do it. But it doesn't happen all the time that way. So,
yeah. Well, man, this was great. And thank you, Michael. We really wanted to hit this because we want people to stop struggling, just sitting out there, not finding anything relevant that they can pursue. Because, and I think the lessons here, we covered it all, but just be proactive, ask a lot of questions. Mike, you wrapped up real good. So I'm not going to do another wrap up, but I think that's a wrap for us. All right. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.